The atmosphere inside the Rayburn House office building on April 15, 2026, was thick with a kind of tension that numbers usually fail to capture. Russell Vought, the White House budget chief, sat before the House Budget Committee. Outside, the news cycle was dominated by the Operation Epic Fury in the Persian Gulf. Inside, the focus was on the checkbook. The question from the committee was straightforward. What is the price tag for the war in Iran? Vought's response was a calculated void. He refused to provide even a baseline estimate. No range, no ballpark figure, no fiscal horizon. For a man whose job is to track every cent of federal spending, this wasn't an oversight. It was a strategic retreat. We are focused on the mission, Vought stated, not on speculative accounting while our troops are in harm's way. But the market doesn't do speculative well. Silence from the Office of Management and Budget usually signals that the reality is too politically radioactive to put into print. While the White House remained silent, the academic world filled the vacuum. A team of senior analysts at Harvard University released an independent assessment on the same morning. Their estimate? The war with Iran, including the surge in regional deployments, the replacement of high-end munitions, and the inevitable long-term care for a new generation of veterans, is projected to cost American taxpayers roughly $1 trillion. $1 trillion. In any other era, that number would be a finality. Today, it is a complication added to a catastrophe. To understand why Vought wouldn't say the number, you have to look at the ticker behind him. As he testified, the U.S. national debt was ticking past $39.6 trillion, hurtling toward the $40 trillion mark at a velocity that has effectively broken the traditional legislative process. The federal government is currently in a state of interest rate paralysis. For the first time in history, the cost of servicing the interest on our debt has surpassed the entire national defense budget. Every missile fired in the Persian Gulf isn't just a military decision, it's a debt servicing event. The silence in the Capitol tells us that the White House has realized a terrifying truth. They are attempting to fund a 21st century high-intensity conflict on a credit card that has already been declined by the future. The $1 trillion war isn't just an expense. It is the spark moving toward a $40 trillion powder keg. How exactly did the American national debt climb to the terrifying $40 trillion abyss we see today? To understand this trajectory, one must realize that for most of its history, the U.S. viewed debt as a temporary tool for crisis, to be paid off in times of peace. As recently as early 2001, the national debt stood at a manageable $5.7 trillion. What followed was a 25-year dismantling of fiscal logic, executed in three distinct jumps. The first jump: geopolitical costs and the revenue gap. The turn of the century marked the end of the post-Cold War peace dividend. The U.S. embarked on decades of high-intensity overseas military operations that eventually cost over $8 trillion. However, the spending was only half the story. In a move that defied economic history, Washington chose a guns and butter policy, funding global dominance while simultaneously enacting massive tax cuts. Unlike previous major conflicts where taxes were raised to pay for the front lines, America chose to borrow every cent. By 2008, the debt shattered the $10 trillion mark. We had institutionalized the idea that a global empire could be funded on a credit card. The second jump: socializing the crisis. The 2008 subprime mortgage collapse forced the federal government to become the rescuer of last resort. Through massive bank bailouts and stimulus packages, Washington essentially moved trillions in private sector risk onto the public ledger. To keep this new debt from crushing the budget, the Federal Reserve introduced quantitative easing, holding interest rates near zero for nearly a decade. This created a period of debt anesthesia. Because borrowing was essentially free, the political class lost all incentive to curb spending. By the time the administration changed in 2017, the debt had doubled again to $20 trillion. The government was now addicted to cheap money. The third jump: the pandemic and the structural wall. The global pandemic served as a vertical accelerator. Between 2020 and 2022, the government pumped trillions into the economy overnight to prevent a total flatline. While the emergency eventually faded, the baseline of government spending stayed permanently higher. As we moved into 2026, we hit the structural wall. An aging population accelerated the costs of Social Security and Medicare, mandatory expenses that are politically untouchable. By the spring of 2026, the debt ticker is hurtling toward $40 trillion, adding nearly $1 trillion every 100 days. The math has finally hit a hard limit. Today, the US government is spending over $1.1 trillion annually just on interest payments. To grasp the severity, interest now accounts for approximately 16% of all federal spending. For every dollar the government collects and spends, 16 cents is consumed by the rent on past debt before a single cent can be allocated to infrastructure, education, or the military. We have reached a grim milestone where the cost of servicing our debt has officially surpassed the entire national defense budget. The US is now in self-devouring mode, borrowing new money simply to pay the interest on the old. This is the fiscal straitjacket the Trump administration inherited, a system so heavy with the ghosts of past spending that it has almost no room to breathe as a new $1 trillion war looms in the Middle East. If the fiscal ship is so clearly taking on water, why isn't anyone in Washington pumping it out? On paper, the solution to a $40 trillion debt is simple. You either spend less or you tax more. In the reality of American politics, however, both doors have been welded shut. The primary reason for this paralysis is the structure of the federal budget itself. Today, roughly 70% of all federal spending is considered mandatory. This includes Social Security, Medicare, and veterans benefits. In Washington, these programs are known as the third rail. Touch them, and your political career dies. With an aging population, these costs are non-negotiable. Any politician who suggests raising the retirement age or trimming benefits faces an immediate electoral firing squad. At the same time, the discretionary side of the budget is dominated by the military-industrial complex. In the midst of a $1 trillion war in Iran, cutting defense is framed as an act of national surrender. Consequently, the government is left with a budget where nearly everything is essential, yet nothing is paid for. While spending is locked, the revenue side is equally stagnant. The two-party system has reached a toxic stalemate. The Republicans view any tax hike as an ideological sin, while the Democrats find it politically impossible to tax their middle-class base or their high-net-worth donors, enough to move the needle on $40 trillion. Instead, both parties have settled into a borrowing pact. They have realized that it is far easier to borrow $1 trillion from the future than to ask a voter for $1 today. This kick-the-can strategy has turned the annual debt ceiling debate into a piece of political theater, a high-stakes drama that always ends with the same result. The ceiling is raised, the debt grows, and the fundamental problem is ignored for another election cycle. For decades, the US had a cheat code to handle this dysfunction: the dollar tide. Historically, when the US ran into trouble, the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates. This would act like a giant vacuum, sucking global liquidity back into US treasuries, effectively forcing the rest of the world to fund America's deficits. But in 2026, the dollar pump is failing. This is the result of two major shifts. First, the anti-fragility of the global South. Led by the BRICS nations, much of the world has spent the last decade building financial defenses against the dollar. Central banks from Shanghai to Riyadh are no longer stockpiling US treasuries, they are buying gold. According to IMF data, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has slipped to its lowest level in 3 decades. The world is no longer as eager to buy American debt. Second, the interest rate blowback. In the past, raising rates was a weapon used against others. Today, because the debt is $40 trillion, raising rates is a weapon that fires backward. Every time the Fed raises rates to defend the dollar, it adds hundreds of billions to the US government's own interest bill. As financial historian Niall Ferguson recently observed, any empire that spends more on debt service than on its own defense will not stay an empire for long. The US is now discovering that its most powerful financial tool, the ability to manipulate global capital flows, has become a double-edged sword. With the dollar tide no longer able to wash away the debt, the pressure has shifted inward, creating a violent friction between the White House and the Federal Reserve. This internal stalemate leads us to the most dangerous friction point in the entire American system: the open warfare between the White House and the Federal Reserve. To understand this collision, you have to realize that the president and the Fed chairman are currently playing two entirely different games with the same deck of cards. Donald Trump, leading an administration fueled by the America First doctrine and an expensive war in Iran, views the economy through the lens of a debtor. From his perspective, the solution to $40 trillion in debt isn't austerity, it's growth and devaluation. He needs the Federal Reserve to slash interest rates to zero or even into negative territory to make the interest on that massive debt manageable. He needs a weaker dollar to boost exports, and more importantly, he needs a central bank that will act as a silent partner in funding the war. For the White House, the Federal Reserve isn't a neutral arbiter. It's an obstacle to national survival. On the other side of the street sits Jerome Powell. The Fed's mandate is price stability and the long-term defense of the dollar's credibility. For Powell, the $40 trillion debt is a looming inflationary bomb. If the Fed caves to the president's demands and prints money to pay for the war, it risks a total collapse of faith in the U.S. sovereign credit. If the dollar loses its status as a stable store of value, the entire global financial architecture, which America sits atop, disintegrates. Powell's logic is cold. To save the currency, he may have to let the government's budget bleed. This is no longer a polite debate over basis points. It is a fundamental struggle for power. In April 2026, we are seeing the presidency attempt a hostile takeover of the central bank's independence. Trump has recently intensified his rhetoric, calling the Fed's current policy treasonous, given the military situation in the Middle East. His legal team is reportedly exploring executive orders that would grant the Treasury Department more direct oversight of interest rate decisions, effectively turning the Fed into a branch of the executive. The systemic contradiction is now absolute. If the Fed maintains high rates to fight inflation, it forces the government into a fiscal meltdown as interest payments eat the remaining budget. If the Fed bows to Trump and lowers rates to fund the war, it risks a hyperinflationary spiral that could devalue every dollar held by every citizen. This is the zero-sum game of a $40 trillion empire. As we move toward the final confrontation, the question isn't whether the Fed is independent. It's whether a nation with a $40 trillion debt and a $1 trillion war can even afford the luxury of an independent central bank. The friction between the administrative will of the president and the monetary logic of the Fed has created a total systemic lock. Neither side can move without triggering a crisis on the other, leaving the world's largest economy stuck in a violent, vibrating stasis. This brings us back to that quiet hearing room in the Rayburn building. The refusal of Budget Chief Russell Vought to provide a concrete cost for the Iran conflict was a frank admission of a new systemic reality. In a world of $40 trillion in debt, the traditional blank check for geopolitical strategy has been replaced by a series of agonizing zero-sum trade-offs. The $1 trillion estimated cost for the Iran operations represents more than just a military expenditure. It is a massive stress test for an already overextended fiscal architecture. In previous decades, the U.S. could absorb such costs through its immense margin of safety. Today, that margin has evaporated. Every dollar spent on a missile in the Persian Gulf is a dollar that creates immediate, measurable pressure on the Treasury's ability to borrow and the Fed's ability to manage inflation. This is the essence of what we call the systemic gridlock. We are seeing a highly sophisticated machine where the parts are no longer working in harmony, but are instead grinding against one another. The president is tasked with executing a high-stakes national security strategy that requires massive, cheap liquidity. Yet the Federal Reserve is tasked with maintaining the integrity of the currency, which, in an era of $40 trillion in debt, requires disciplined, expensive credit. The collision between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell is a fundamental dispute over the steering wheel. It is a debate over which priority takes precedence when the budget no longer allows for everything to be a priority at once. If the administrative branch succeeds in exerting more control over monetary policy, the dollar becomes a more flexible tool for short-term government needs, but potentially a less stable anchor for global trade. If the Fed maintains its absolute independence, the government faces a fiscal squeeze that will force a radical and painful reassessment of America's global commitments. The $40 trillion figure has become a new normal of high-intensity friction. The U.S. system is recalibrating under extreme pressure. The institutional deadlock we see today, The silence from the budget office, the record-breaking interest payments, and the public sparring over interest rates is the sound of a superpower learning to operate within its physical and mathematical limits. The era of infinite maneuverability is over. What remains is a system that must now weigh every geopolitical ambition against its fiscal cost in real time.